Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending the first session of the special online seminar entitled 20 Years of the 2003 Convention, Retrospect and Prospect. My name is Kanami Namiki, Associate Fellow of IRCI. I will be your MC today. This special online seminar is organized on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage, or the 2003 Convention. And this is a part of the seminar series of IRCI's Asia Pacific Research Forum for ICH Safeguarding, a platform that has been established by IRCI to promote research and international cooperation in the Asia Pacific region. The seminar consists of two sessions. The first session, which is held today, addresses the theme of advancement of the safeguarding of ICH, the 2003 Convention and beyond. And the second session, which will be held next Wednesday, November 1st, at the same time, will feature dialogue with the bearers of ICH elements on the list of the convention, inviting practitioners and experts of Intangible Cultural Heritage, or ICH, as well as various stakeholders. The seminar will review the progress and challenges of ICH safeguarding in the Asia-Pacific region from the diverse perspectives and standpoints while looking into the future of ICH. To officially open the seminar, I would like to invite Daisuke Machida, Director General of IRCI, for his opening remarks.
Dear panelists, dear participants, it's my great pleasure to say a few words on behalf of IRCI and welcoming all of you to the special online seminar, 20 Years of the 2003 Convention, Retrospect and Prospect. This special seminar is organized to mark the 20th anniversary of the Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage. Last year, IRCI inaugurated the Asia-Pacific Research Forum for ICH Safeguarding as a platform for enhancing interaction among researchers in the Asia-Pacific region. Online seminars have been programmed as a major activity of this forum, and we intend to invite a wide range of participants, including all those interested in safeguarding intangible cultural heritage from the entire Asia-Pacific region and beyond. For this fiscal year, 3 online seminars are scheduled, and we decided to organize 2 of them to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the convention. As a matter of fact, these 2 have been integrated into one seminar that contains 2 sessions. The information on the seminar is shared on UNESCO's anniversary celebration website. Today, in session 1, titled Advancement of the Safeguarding of ICH, the 2003 Convention and Beyond, the panel will reflect from diverse standpoints on the safeguarding of ICH in the past 20 years and the way it should be in the future. We are most honored to have a commentator, a moderator, and 6 experts as presenters, all with outstanding achievements in research or policymaking on ICH safeguarding. In session 2, to be held next Wednesday, we will listen to the actual voices of practitioners and experts related to ICH on the list under the convention. I hope today's lively discussions will contribute to the promotion of research on ICH safeguarding in the region. Thank you for your attention.
Now let's start the session, Advancement of the Safeguarding of ICH, the 2003 Convention and then beyond. This session aims to reflect on panelists' various commitments and viewpoints to ICH safeguarding in the past 20 years and explore the future of ICH and its safeguarding. Today, we are so grateful that we have 6 panelists who will be presenting in 2 groups. The first group will be sharing with us their perspectives and experiences in the framework of the convention. The latter group will particularly focus on the cases of Papua New Guinea, the country that has no inscribed element yet on the list, as well as Maldives and Australia that have not ratified the convention. And after each group's presentation, there will be short Q&A sessions among the panelists. The Q&A sessions and the panel discussion will be moderated by Mr. Tomo Ishimura, the Director of the Department of Intangible Cultural Heritage, Tokyo National Research Institute for Cultural Properties. Also, we have Mr. Chris Ballard, Associate Professor of College of Asia and the Pacific, the Australian National University, joining us today as a commentator, who will be providing a comment after all the presentations before the general discussions. Now, I would like to ask our moderator, Mr. Ishimura, for a few words.
Good afternoon, dear distinguished speakers and participants. I'm Tomo Ishimura, Director of the Department of Intangible Cultural Heritage, Tokyo National Research Institute for Cultural Properties. I'll serve as a moderator for this meeting. This year marks the 20th anniversary of the enactment of the 2003 Convention. Over the past 20 years, the world situation has changed significantly, and the role of the 2003 Convention has changed accordingly. The original purpose of this convention is to provide international safeguarding for ICH, which is difficult to survive. Of course, this original purpose has not changed today. However, now the convention has taken on more of a role. For example, the convention is expected to play an active role in achievement of SDGs. The convention is also expected to make some contribution to the solution of climate change and to realization of cultural diversity. In response to this situation, we would like to make a critical review of the history of the convention and consider how it should develop in the future. This symposium brought together the right and eligible people to discuss this issue. I'm very privileged to be here as a moderator, and I'm very looking forward to a lively discussion with all of you. Thank you very much.
Now, I will introduce our first speaker, Ms. Noriko Aikawa. She is the former Director of Intangible Cultural Heritage Section in UNESCO. She is presenting on safeguarding of ICH, the 20 years after the adoption of the Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage. In this presentation, she will examine and analyze how UNESCO has been promoting the 2003 Convention among its member states during last decades. Please welcome Ms. Noriko Aikawa.
Thank you very much for your kind presentation. Mr. Machida, the director of IRCI, and Mr. Ishimura, both of whom I have known since 20 years. So I'm very happy to see you again. So my presentation is it's about how the convention started at the beginning, because I was really directly in charge of the preparation of the convention at the UNESCO headquarters. And then I like to present some of my wishful thinking for the future of the convention. So my presentation is about, first of all, how the 2003 convention came into existence. Secondly, the challenges at the early stage, how the challenges were addressed and resolved, and the future of the convention. Next, please. So how the 2003 convention came into existence. I know that you are all aware of this, but briefly, just to remind you that in 1973, the Bolivia requested UNESCO a protocol to the Universal Copyright Convention. It started at the beginning as a copyright international regulation, but very soon it's changed for the sake of the safeguarding of ICH. And then, so it is to protect the popular arts and cultural patrimony of all nations. And then UNESCO presented a document establishing international instrument for the protection of folklore, applying, it's always at the beginning, it's about the copyright, the major concern of the experts and the states were the copyright protection. But when we discussed the intangible cultural heritage, they all discovered that the copyright protection is not suitable. Then UNESCO and WIPO, because at this time, during that period, UNESCO and WIPO worked very closely together. So it established a model provision for the national laws on the protection of expressions of folklore against illicit and other prejudicial actions in 1982. So this was considered premature. Then next, please. In 1984, UNESCO attempted to create a model law for the protection of folklore. Oh, I'm sorry, I repeated. Then 1982, the governmental expert meeting took place, and it gave the definition of folklore. In 1985, UNESCO alone organized an expert meeting. In 1989, UNESCO established a recommendation on the safeguarding of a traditional culture and folklore. Next, please. 1992, the Intangible Heritage Program was created at the UNESCO headquarters, and the priority was given to the revitalization and transmission of intangible cultural heritage. Now, from now on, I call it ICH. Today, now at the headquarters of UNESCO, they decided to call it living heritage. And they found that ICH is a rather strange name. So now they decided to call it living heritage. But I remain using the former name, intangible cultural heritage. So priority was revitalization and transmission, and the safeguarding priority was given to the ICH in danger of disappearing and community-based approach for the safeguarding. So the particular attention was drawn not to crystallize and not to folklorize the ICH. And it was very strongly stressed that it is absolutely necessary to use the different approach to the tangible heritage protection. In 1993, the Living Human Heritage Program was established thanks to the very strong proposal from Republic of Korea. And 1993, the Washington conference took place, and the conference decided that it is very necessary that UNESCO create a legally binding instrument. And 1989 recommendation was too much focused on the documentation and not enough on the living heritage and and communities of the bearers of the heritage. So this Washington conference really all the participants thought that the 1989 recommendation was too much focused on documentation and not enough on the living heritage and the communities of the bearers of the heritage. So this is how and also the Washington conference thought that the term folklore is no longer suitable, and they recommended that the intangible cultural heritage should be used in place of folklore, and it gave the definition of the intangible cultural heritage, which is now reflected on the convention. And between 1995 and 99, worldwide appraisal of the application of the 1989 recommendation was made region by region by Secretary of UNESCO. And 1999, at the Smithsonian institutions, a conference was organized to summarize this 6 regional appraisal meetings on the application of a 1989 recommendation. So then this Smithsonian conference concluded that the recommendation places too much emphasis on the documentation, research, and archiving instead of actors and producers of ICH. So they conclude that it is necessary that UNESCO create the new normative instrument centered on the actors and the practitioners. Next, please. In 1997, Intangible Cultural Heritage Program was given the highest priority in UNESCO Cultural Program. At that time, Director General was Federico Mayor, the Spanish Director General, and Mr. Mayor considered that the intangible cultural heritage is very important, at least as important as tangible cultural heritage, which made UNESCO well known to the world thanks to the World Heritage Convention. Proclamation of masterpieces of oral and intangible cultural heritage of humanity was launched in 1998. And in 2001, the first proclamation of 19 masterpieces was proclaimed. In 2003, the 28 masterpieces were proclaimed. And at the same time, the preparation of convention started. In 1999, there was a conference in Washington, which took place together with the Smithsonian institutions, and it reviewed of the concept of the heritage. And natural and cultural heritage, including tangible heritage, means natural and cultural heritage, including tangible and intangible heritage. In 2001, the General Conference of UNESCO adopted the Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity. Next, please. 2001, there is a round table for the safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage took place in Torino in Italy. And 2002, a round table on the intangible cultural heritage and cultural diversity took place in Istanbul. And it was a very crucial meeting for the preparation of the convention, because for this conference, there was 110 states participated and 72 cultural ministers participated. It was a very political conference, but as UNESCO is an intergovernmental organization, it was crucial to convince and draw attention of the government of the state parties. So this Istanbul meeting was very efficient, and it was indispensable. So they made a declaration which is recognized the value of the intangible cultural heritage and recommended the adoption of the new international convention. In 2002, the first intergovernmental meeting of experts on the preliminary draft convention for the safeguarding of the intangible heritage took place in Paris. And between 2002 and 2003, I think there were 8 intergovernmental meetings to draft the convention were organized. In 2003, the General Conference of UNESCO adopted the draft convention. In 2004, the convention entered into force. Next, please. So what are the renovating aspects of the 2003 convention? The first, the consideration of this heritage as process and practice rather than end product. Next point is the recognition of this heritage as a source of identity, creativity, diversity, and social practices. Then next point was the respect for its practitioners, respect for its practitioners' constantly evolving creativities and its interaction with nature. Respect for this heritage and its practitioners. Primary role of the artist practitioners and communities, and priority in intergenerational transmission, education, and training. The primary role of the artist practitioners and communities, and a priority on the intergenerational transmission, education, and training. Continue the renovating aspect of the convention is that the respect for this heritage and its practitioners, because intangible cultural heritage has not been treated at the same level as tangible cultural heritage, at least in UNESCO, for a long time. So this was very important that the convention was established to be at the same level as tangible heritage. And it inculcates sense of pride and most powerful driving force and fostering. And also it fostered self-motivation for the safeguarding ICs. Next, please. So challenges are that the first step, the sensibilization of the convention among the state parties. And this was very important. And at the same time, UNESCO launched a program called the Proclamation of Masterpieces of Intangible Cultural Heritage, which were very useful to raise awareness of the member states on what is intangible cultural heritage and how important it is. And so then encouragement for the ratification of the convention. That was the first step. The second step is the implementation stage. It is to encourage state parties to implement the convention. And the third step is the assessment of the state of implementation of the convention among the state parties. And in 2013, UNESCO launched the project called Overall Result Framework Assessment. And this was derived from the international oversight evaluation. Within the UNESCO, there is a service called International Oversight. And this evaluation recommended very strongly that it is very important to do the assessment. So in 2013, the Intangible Cultural Heritage section of UNESCO undertook this assessment. Next, please. Also, I continue the challenges that the identification, inventorying, and safeguarding IRCI at the national level it's the most crucial point. But UNESCO, as I told you, that it's an intergovernmental organization, and our partners are only government, and we don't have much access to the private or NGOs or private sectors of each state party. So we need to go through the government. Also, the second point, important point, is monitoring the safeguarding activities of IRCI at the national level. But it is, again, very difficult for UNESCO to do the monitoring directly to the communities or safeguarding scientific research centers of each state parties. So we have to go through the national commissions of UNESCO and central services of each government. So the third point challenge is how to harness ICH for the sustainable development. It's been insisted for last few years to connect the ICH safeguarding to the sustainable development. It's been rather difficult to convince the government because sustainable development is within the economic sector, and in all countries, the economic sector and the cultural sectors are not really communicating each other. So this is how why it is very difficult to develop this aspect, and how to integrate ICH into education curriculum. This point has been taken into account in many countries today. So then the last point is how to encourage indigenous and minority people to safeguarding their own ICH. This is also very difficult for UNESCO to promote this aspect because it's an intergovernmental organization. UNESCO has no access to indigenous or minority communities. Next, please. I think it's the end. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Mr. Gamini Wijesuriya. He has been working in the heritage field for 45 years, and he is currently the supervisor to the Director General of ICROM, International Center for the Study of the Preservation and Restoration of Cultural Property, where he has been a part of its official delegation for 15 years. He is also the special advisor to the Director General of WITLAP, World Heritage Institute of Training and Research for the Asia and the Pacific region. His presentation titled Two Conventions, One Paradigm, Intangibles focuses on the 1972 convention that has embraced many intangible aspects and community connections. He will also discuss the continued campaign against separating tangibles and intangibles. Mr. Wijesuriya, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, organizers, for the invitation. We are gathered here to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the 2003 Convention for Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage. Let me extend my congratulations, first of all. Over the past 5 years, I have been involved directly with the convention as a facilitator for capacity building, a member of the National ICH Committee, and of course, helping periodic reporting exercise to be held next year. I was also involved in the preparation of one of the 2 nominations that Sri Lanka presented for the representative list. Of course, my interest in intangible heritage, however, goes far beyond my activities with the 2003 convention. It goes back to 1978 when I started my career as a conservator, followed by my appointment to the position of Head of Conservation of Sri Lanka in 1983. Having to oversee the conservation of heritage across the country, the majority of which comprised religious buildings, meant impossible task to separate tangibles and intangibles. In 1982, I started working with the 1972 convention and played diverse roles. In this forum, I have been asked to reflect on the perspectives of 1972 convention, which, by the way, celebrated its 50th anniversary last year. The 1972 convention is known for its strong bias or focus on tangible heritage, and the 2003 convention has subsequently championed intangible heritage. In the capacity building resource of the 2003 convention, there is a note about the two conventions, including this comparison, and I'm not going to go into that. In this slide, I have extracted several key concepts or dimensions or characteristics of intangible heritage from the 2003 convention, very well developed. That will also form the basis of my talk. I assert that almost all these can equally be ascribed to and indeed are fundamental to tangible heritage. Nevertheless, they were mostly absent from the 1972 convention, but have now been embraced. It is in this context that I have framed the title of my presentation, Two Conventions, One Paradigm, with reference to intangibles. In this presentation, I will demonstrate how the tangible heritage in general and in the context of 72 convention in particular has embraced intangible dimensions. Heritage sector, tangible heritage sector, if you want to say, ignore the intangible, heavy focus on materiality, not recognizing intangibles, not recognizing traditional knowledge systems. Heritage discourse has evolved with a heavy focus on materiality or tangibles from the outset since it developed in the mid-19th century in Europe. It concentrated on the conservation of tangibles, or what we usually refer to as monuments and sites. It originated as a reaction against the attempts of certain groups to revitalize religious buildings and a focus on intangible dimensions of historic structures and places. One such group, for instance, was the Camden Society of Cambridge, 1839, which demanded restoration of churches with a view to returning them to religious splendor of the Middle Ages. A heavy focus on materiality at the time opposed such renewal or continuity as desired by the community groups. Instead, conservation that sought to freeze its tangible aspects effectively became the standard aim of those who pioneered the modern conservation movement. Modern conservation movement undoubtedly formed the foundation of contemporary heritage discourse, but many gaps and assumptions have revealed themselves over the course of its development. The lack of focus on intangibles is one such major gap for which I could give you many examples, but let me highlight two. When the French prepared conservation plan for the Angkor Wat, they wanted to remove all the temples where the Buddhist monks were living because they wanted to see the beauty of Angkor Wat for the when they were sitting in the guest house they planned. This is a stupa in ruined condition that was built in Sri Lanka in the 1st century BC. This and other stupas are constructed as tangible expressions of religious ideology, intangibles, that invested traditional knowledge and skills in the creation and continued care of them by the Buddhist community. Western archaeologists overlooked the intangible dimensions embedded in these practices and described those who cared or restored the stupas as pious vandals. You see in this slide in a book in which we compiled the traditional knowledge systems of Asia. If you want, you can download this free. These were completely ignored when modern heritage discourse was in development. But let's talk about some positive things and recent developments. This diagram shows the evolution of tangible heritage sector with direct influence of 1972 since 70s. In this evolution, post-1990 period shows an increased focus on people, thereby various dimensions of intangible heritage described above. The debate on importance of intangible has started, and all these activities had focused on intangibles. And let me share one or two examples. Some of these things listed here have all intangible dimensions. In 2003, ICOMOS, which is famous for its focus on tangibles, held a special General Assembly in Africa dedicated to discussion of intangible heritage. The conclusion that emerged was that tangibles and intangible heritage are interdependent, and former occurring as a result of the latter. Heritage places are the results of living traditions and practices. Next one is living heritage. You already heard how it entered into the 2003 convention, but at the same time, tangible heritage sector has also worked on it. I know it's now taken over by a 2003 convention, but countries like Sri Lanka had already begun to draw on the notion of living heritage in their conservation work for many years, but it was ICROM who brought the concept to the international heritage domain. Living Heritage Program of ICROM evolved as an offspring of the Integrated Territorial and Urban Conservation Program started in 1997. And the first strategy meeting to develop the concept was held in 2003 in Asia, in Bangkok. I had the privilege of leading this program from 2004 to 2008. The key concepts or determinants of living heritage were identified as continuity, community, but without compartmentalizing tangible and intangible as in the slide. Conservation was considered as managing continuity, which is tantamount to ensuring viability. In fact, our friends in the Western world consider these as Western, non-Western paradigms. This is a slide from one of my colleagues. A major international forum on living religious heritage was subsequently organized as part of ICROM's Living Heritage Program, participating all religions and all parts of the world. Participants at this event overwhelmingly agreed that tangibles could not be considered separately from intangibles when dealing with religious heritage. This slide shows some of the key developments of the 1972 convention, which we want to talk about, that embrace tangible dimension. Let me give one or two examples. Some of these ideas: cultural landscape, traditional knowledge system, which was recognized in 2005, communities linking nature and culture, people-centered approaches to conservation, rights issues and right-based approach, UNESCO policy on sustainable development. The introduction of the cultural landscape, for instance, recognized diverse intangible dimensions that focus on interaction between humans and nature. Increased focus on communities, which was missing, was another major development. You can see the statement from former UNESCO chief, Mr. Masura, which started the entering of communities into the 72 convention. In 2007, communities was integrated as one of the 5 strategic objectives of the community, the World Heritage Committee. The 40th anniversary of the 1972 convention held in 2012 was fully dedicated to communities. The conclusion of the year-long celebrations formulated by the finally Kyoto Vision have very specific references to communities and intangible heritage, as you can see in the slide. The Sustainable Development Policy, I know Intangible Heritage 2003 Convention has also made focus on this. Developed by this Sustainable Development Policy of UNESCO was a breakthrough in the 1972 Convention, which also brought the rights issues and contribution of heritage towards the livelihood of people. Unfortunately, this has not been referred to by the 2003 convention in its work. I hope it will happen soon. These are some of the references in the to the intangible heritage in the operational guidelines of 1972 convention. I'm not going to read all these things, but there are many. The most prominent among them is the definition of attributes. Outstanding universal value of 72 convention requires the elaboration of values and identifying what they call attributes that hold the values. Attributes are ones that can be managed. That is why they need to identify attributes. It is well established that attributes can be tangible as well as intangible elements. Intangibles, therefore, are now an integral part of the 72 convention. This is the Temple of the Tooth Relic of Sri Lanka, which is one of the World Heritage Sites for its outstanding universal value. Its attributes identified are the tangible, the aspects of temple structures, paintings, and so on, whereas intangible attributes identified are the traditions that came from from 5th century AD traditions, practices, and this pageant, which is one of the most famous in the Asian region. So, a people-centered approach to conservation and management of cultural and natural heritage has since been developed and promoted as an extension of the living heritage approach. This captures the tangible, tangible and intangible heritage and places communities at the heart of the discourse, which is not a bad idea for intangible heritage as well. Before I conclude, let me mention that the term safeguarding has its own definition in 2003. You can see the definition in the slide. This is considered very specific to intangible heritage as fundamental tool for protecting intangible heritage. It focuses on viability in contrast to conservation in the heritage sector and the 1972 convention. The term safeguarding, however, is heavily used in the tangible heritage sector, including 1972 convention. It started also by UNESCO with its campaign for safeguarding world cultural heritage, which began with Nubian campaign. And I argue that this is applicable to every type of heritage without discrimination, while recognizing there are specificities and context dependency in all our efforts to protect heritage. The notion of conservation as managing continuity is a similar focus on viability. Reference to safeguarding the 72 convention and operational guidelines is in the table. Now, I hope I have explained the perspectives of 72, at least some, very briefly, 72 convention in terms of safeguarding intangible heritage and highlighted the issues created by approaching this as a standalone category of heritage. So what can we do? Now, let me make a suggestion. The natural and cultural heritage sectors worked for 40 years under the umbrella of 1972 convention, but independently in their own silos without exploring the potentials for synergies across the activities. As far back as 2001, in this very land, I made a proposal for a marriage between those two sectors, which of course took a while, which was finally realized in 2013. You can see many activities happening under the World Heritage Leadership Program, linking nature and culture. I'm very happy. And now, of course, we have a common paradigm that brings us together. And can we make some suggestions? Okay, I would suggest such a union of the two conventions. As we have seen, they are already dating, and taking the formal plunge would enable greater potential for synergy, collaboration, and partnership in our endeavor to safeguard all heritage. So my suggestion is that there is a time, the time is right for a good marriage between the two and to talk to each other very closely, like what happened in the natural and cultural sector. I can't explain details here. Just in 2013, after 40 years. Thank you very much for listening.
Now we have a presenter from UNESCO. Ms. Susanne Schnuttgen is the Chief of Unit Capacity Building, UNESCO Living Heritage Entity. Her presentation entitled 20 Years of the 2003 Convention. Sorry about that. Her presentation entitled 20 Years of the 2003 Convention, Achievements and Recent Developments will outline the key achievement of the convention, particularly its foundational objective, that is, to raise awareness of the importance of safeguarding living heritage. She will highlight some of the steps taken by the governing bodies of the convention and the global capacity building program to achieve these objectives, and speak about the sole vision that provides future direction for the implementation of the convention to unleash the power of living heritage for peace and sustainable development. Ms. Schnuttgen, the floor is yours.
Good morning to Mr. Machida, the Director General of IRCI, to Mr. Ishimura. And I would like to express my gratitude for having been asked to join this distinguished panel. It is a particular pleasure for me to see our former colleague and much honored former Secretary, Ms. Noriko Aikawa. Hello, Noriko. We haven't seen each other in a little while. And of course, also some of the experts we are working with. And I'm here with my colleague, Nicholas Tan, who's the Regional Officer for Asia and the Pacific, and also in that capacity closely in touch with IRCI. And of course, I'm also coordinating our relationships with the Category 2 centers. And so it's a real pleasure to be here today. Next slide, please. Well, so my presentation, I first want to talk a bit about the rationale for creating the convention, maybe just adding a bit to what Noriko Aikawa already elaborated on in much more detail, and some changes that resulted from the implementation, talk about different milestones in a bit more detail and the ways forward. Next slide, please. So I want to, in the beginning, I like to show this slide because really the conventions from the beginning in the logic of UNESCO were meant to see as a whole. The international instruments, and these are all instruments of international law in the field of culture, they have to be seen together in order to inform holistic cultural policies. Just to recall, I think in this group of panelists, we may not need to, but maybe for some of the viewers, the main objectives of the convention are, of course, to safeguard the intangible cultural heritage, which means ensuring the viability of it, ensuring that it can continue. It's about respect for intangible cultural heritage and the groups, communities, individuals concerned. It's very much about raising awareness at all levels, local, national, and international, of the importance of intangible heritage and of ensuring mutual appreciation thereof. And of course, also international cooperation, because these conventions are also an expression of a joint will of the international community to take care of the cultural heritage in this world jointly. And that is a very important ethical founding principle for all the conventions, in fact. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of understanding the different concepts, we often contrast the World Heritage and Intangible Cultural Heritage notions in the two conventions. very simply speaking, the World Heritage Convention is about sites, monuments, and landscapes, whereas what is being safeguarded under the 2003 Convention are cultural practices, expression, skills, knowledge. The World Heritage Convention has the notion of properties, whereas in intangible, and is protecting specific properties, whereas under the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention, states parties are asked to safeguard all intangible cultural heritage present in their territories. There's the notion of the outstanding universal value in the World Heritage Convention, which emphasizes an expert perspective. And then the intangible cultural heritage perspective, it's very community focused. It's only nobody outside a community or group can define whether something is considered intangible cultural heritage, but it has to be defined by the communities themselves. And then there's this concept of authenticity and integrity help define the value, and more focused on keeping things, conserving, whereas intangible has a stronger focus on the living and the dynamic. Now, I think I only want to refer to the convention's definitions, because I think it's important for us to always recall that it's about the practices, representations, expressions, knowledge, and skills. So that's what we are trying to safeguard, as well as the instrument objects, artifacts, and cultural spaces. So here you have material. And then this focus on communities. It's the communities, groups, and in some cases, individuals that recognize this as part of their heritage. Then there's this idea of transmission from generation to generation, so continuity, and in the continuity, the change, that while communities transmit this heritage from generation to generation, it also always is being adapted in the interaction with nature. Here we have nature again and their history, and it provides the sense of identity and continuity. And all of this is from a global perspective, helping us to understand cultural diversity and to encourage respect for it. Now, there are also some limits. Huh? There's not everything goes under the convention. Of course, human rights and mutual respect, these principles have to be respected. Thank you. Next. Yeah, I just wanted to also invite people who have not yet done so to visit the 2003 Convention website, because we have this wonderful tool, which is called Dive into Intangible Cultural Heritage, which actually was based on all the inscriptions that have, all the elements that have been inscribed today. And it's a bit like an interactive game where you can see, okay, what domains do the different inscriptions belong to? How are they related? And so one gets a clearer idea of the different domains: oral traditions, performing arts, traditional craftsmanship, social practices, rituals, festive events, knowledge and practices concerning nature and the universe, while also seeing that you can't really separate them neatly. They're all also interacting with each other. Next slide, please. So some milestones and achievements now that we know what we're talking about is intangible cultural heritage. So what we have observed is that with this convention, there has been a paradigm shift in the sense that the notion of cultural heritage was expanded. So from sites to monuments to include cultural practices. Huh? Communities were placed clearly at the heart of defining, safeguarding intangible cultural heritage. There's not the notion of outstanding value in this convention, and it is therefore like a dynamic concept, something that evolves. Next slide. What we can see today is that this has been a very popular convention. The ratification has been very speedy, and today we have nearly universal ratification. So 181 countries form part of this community of states parties after the convention entered into force in 2006. And we just passed the date of the anniversary. So yeah, congratulations to all of you, because all of you have played a very active part in giving life to this convention. And I wanted to appreciate that also from the perspective of the UNESCO Secretariat. So thank you and happy anniversary to all. Next slide, please. So in terms of the major changes, what we can see as, today we can see that the concept of intangible cultural heritage is an established concept in heritage discourse and in international heritage law. We can also see that while 20 years ago, only very few countries had intangible cultural heritage integrated in their policies, today almost all states parties have done so in one way or the other. Sometimes, I mean, it ranges from putting in place specific consultative mechanisms, specific provisions, sometimes policy documents, but in particular in cultural policies, there is a consideration now of intangible cultural heritage. And that is, of course, a great achievement. And the fact that we have a listing mechanism under this convention that gives so much visibility to intangible cultural heritage has also helped a lot in this. So there is an increasing acknowledgement of this concept, and starting also to become more acknowledged in sustainable development work. I'm going to speak a bit more about that later. Next slide, please. So here, this slide just gives a quick overview of some of the key dates that we have identified to help understand the achievements of the convention. Here you have the lists, you have a reference to the Global Capacity Building Program. You have the first NGO forum on intangible cultural heritage that was in 2012. You have the operational directives on sustainable development that were already mentioned in 2016. You have also we had measures to improve the accessibility of international assistance, of the mechanism of international assistance, which is much more used now than in the early years of the convention. We have a new global program that we created on living heritage and education. And I also picked up from Noriko's presentation the observation that more countries are actually working on this, because transmission of living heritage through formal and non-formal education is even recognized as a safeguarding measure in the convention. Then there was the reform of the convention's reporting mechanism in the context of the overall results framework and a revision of the listing mechanism. I will talk to each of these now, these points. So the lists, if you think 20 years ago, we had nothing internationally on the list. And today, the representative list actually has 568 elements corresponding to 136 countries. You know, we have two lists. The second list is the list of intangible cultural heritage in need of urgent safeguarding, which is a bit less used by the states. We have 76 elements corresponding to 40 countries. We have another mechanism, which is the register of good safeguarding practices, where 33 elements from 31 countries are registered, actually. So for the purpose of this slide, I wanted to emphasize 676 elements from 140 countries. That is a big achievement that we have been able to, the states parties to actually give visibility to that, to thereby also increase the awareness of what intangible cultural heritage is. Next slide, please. So for the NGOs, maybe just quickly to recognize, there has been much of a development with the NGOs also, and they have now a fixed agenda item during the committee sessions and have been active in also analyzing their own competencies of those NGOs that are accredited. There is this possibility to become an accredited NGO to provide advisory services also to the committee. Next slide, please. We have already mentioned in previous presentations the operational directives, the new chapter on safeguarding intangible cultural heritage and sustainable development. This has to be seen in the context of the global UN-wide development of identifying sustainable development goals and the Agenda 2030 on, there was this report, The Future We Want. And so the states parties decided to actually see and how far this also relates to the intangible cultural heritage. And it goes back though, I mean, the convention in its preamble already was saying that intangible cultural heritage is the mainspring of cultural diversity, and cultural diversity is the driver for development and as important for development as also biodiversity is for nature. So the idea is not new, but it was in 2016 that states parties gave more detail on this, also through an expert meeting, a bit like the same processes that Noriko so nicely explained in the development, the drafting of the convention. Next slide, please. So just to illustrate, for example, we have 109 listed living heritage elements that are relevant to the Sustainable Development Goal 2, Zero Hunger, 241 elements about decent work and economic growth, 144 elements about responsible consumption and production. There's more to be said, just to illustrate. Next slide, please. Now, the capacity building program was conceptualized in 2009 and became operational in 2011. Yeah, a particularity is its facilitators network. We have some of them here with us. We are very, very proud to have such wonderful experts in our network. And the Secretariat develops the materials, the approaches, together with experts, with experts, and often they are members of the facilitators network. And then it's through the facilitators network that we can reach out in the different regions and localities to provide the capacity building. And that has been very positively evaluated in external evaluations. We've gotten very positive feedback, and it's a program that continues to evolve. There were some strategic shifts. In the beginning, it focused just on the mechanisms of the convention. Now, increasingly, it focuses also on thematic issues. Periodic reporting has become a core, a very big capacity building program, because it is so important to have the monitoring against the overall results framework that was adopted. Okay, next one. I see I don't have much time, but let me just, so here some, I think this will be made available to you. You have some numbers on the achievements of the capacity building program. Next slide, please. There's also international assistance, just as a takeaway. There's been a lot of work to make the mechanism better known, better understood, and it's growing. I mean, it's being used more and more. Very interesting projects funded, all available on the webpage. Next slide, please. Yeah, just to see, here's a graph on the positive development of the international assistance use with a little bit of a backdrop during COVID. Next slide, please. The Living Heritage and Education Program, I just quickly mentioned it in the beginning. The particularity here is that it allows us to practice or to support a broad-based approach to safeguarding living heritage, and at the same time contributes to improving relevance and quality education, which is why both sectors, education and culture, are very interested in this. Next. Again, some of the key achievements what this does. We will go beyond it. We don't go into this now because of time, for time reasons. The overall results framework, just that you also have it here with the date, the 2018. For the first time, we developed a results framework to be able to monitor the progress of implementing the convention. And this was the basis for the new periodic reporting system, which we've put in place. Next slide, please. This has worked very well together with this new framework and the capacity building program. I tell you, we have almost 100% implementation rates from the 3 regions that have already reported. which are actually Latin America. We can't go into the findings at this point, but you can look at the slides also later, and it has the references to the analytical reports. So Latin America, Europe, and Arab states. We're discussing Arab states at this committee, have already finished their reporting. Africa is ongoing, and Asia Pacific is next. Yes, please. Next one. Nick, we can, I think, skip these because for time, but it's nice for the participants to have this. There was also a reflection on, we continuously try to improve with through developing the operational directives. So for the lists, the important thing was to make it a bit lighter, a bit more so that really also those regions and countries that have not yet participated could participate better. And there's the Article 18. So this one is on Article 18, the good safeguarding practices. There's the register, but lately there has been a long discussion. How can we ensure that communities can interact more dynamically on their safeguarding practices, learn better from one another? And there is this idea in the room about creating a platform, which is lighter than the inscription process, which goes through a very rigorous evaluation process. So that is also under discussion. That's the latest development. So the committee will also talk about this. Next one, please. I'm coming to the end. So ways forward. We are in the 20th anniversary. Next one, please. So the big celebration we had was the Seoul meeting in July. And there we formulated a vision focusing very much. We were saying, okay, it's great that the concept is now accepted. It has entered policies, intangible cultural heritage. The awareness has been raised worldwide. Now we really need to make sure we are unleashing its power for sustainable development. And the Seoul vision gives some more concrete ideas of how this could be done. Next slide, please. So it also says we need to strengthen further the civil society involvement and use. We need to reach out to new audiences. We cannot stay in the culture sector. We need to have people in emergency and biodiversity and natural disaster responses on board. So there is a whole big audience out there that we have not yet involved in the intangible cultural heritage safeguarding that we need if we want to be effective. And then the synergies. We had the chance that Gamini talked about this a lot, and it is really, especially since Mondia Kult, the Mondia Kult 2022 conference of ministers of cultures, they said cultural policies have to be holistic. They have to integrate all the culture conventions, and we need to work on these synergies. So we have a meeting in Naples at the end of November, which is specifically dedicated to synergies between the 1972 and the 2003 convention. Next, please. So this is the promotion of the contribution to living heritage for sustainable development is at the core. Next, please. And we are working on these different thematic programs to do this. Now, just for your information, if you have any other events you want to add to the webpage, which actually we have set up to collect all of the interesting things that are happening, including this meeting. We have the Seoul anniversary campaign where we said we are living heritage, and it has already been quite successful and will be concluded at the committee meeting in December, where I hope to meet some of you. I apologize, Ms. Namiki, for taking a bit more time than I was supposed to, and hope this added to something to our reflection. Thank you very much.
Now all presentation of the first group are done. So before we move on, I would like to invite our moderator, Mr. Ishimura, to have a brief Q&A session with the first three panelists, Ms. Aikawa, Mr. Wijesuriya, and Ms. Schnuttgen. All other panelists and the commentator, Mr. Ballard, are also welcome to join the Q&A.
And thank you very much, Ms. Aikawa, Mr. Wijesuriya, and Ms. Schnuttgen for your wonderful speech. Firstly, I'd like to say a few comments. Ms. Aikawa's presentation included a clear explanation of the establishment of the 2003 convention. When considering the future of the convention, it is essential and important to understand the history of the convention. We can say that Ms. Aikawa is the godmother of the 2003 convention, and I really enjoyed to hear her valuable story. Mr. Wijesuriya addressed the ambitious idea of the union of the 2000 convention and the 1972 convention, the World Heritage Convention. He pointed out the importance of intangible element, intangible cultural heritage. There are still differences in the philosophy and operation between the two conventions, but in recent years, the two conventions have come closer in terms of the emphasis of the relationship between heritage and community. Ms. Schnuttgen's presentation demonstrates that the 2003 convention developed and 2000 convention's development in the past 20 years and the possibility that can contribute to today's global issues, such as sustainable development and peace building. Recently, ICH is often called as living heritage. Over its 20 years history, the 2003 convention has also evolved organically, like a living thing, and its role has expanded. So that's all for my short comment. Now, we'd like to start a short Q&A session. I also would like to invite Ms. Chris Ballard for commentator here. Then, dear panelists, Ms. Aikawa, Mr. Wijesuriya, Ms. Schnuttgen, and Mr. Ballard, please share any question or comment you may have regarding the first three presentations. So please start from Chris. Do you have some words?
I do. I mean, I do have a kind of a formal opening later on to say my piece. So I'll just be very brief. I mean, I think that was a fascinating mix and a blend of perspectives on the convention. Aikawa Sensei's kind of depth of understanding of the origins. And one of the things recently I did was to go through a lot of the discussions from those early meetings like Torino. And there's an extraordinary wealth of discussion in those early meetings. And while I know the convention is not concerned with archiving, its own archive is actually of extraordinary value as a kind of as a history of that trajectory of thought, producing the convention in its current form, which the more I look at it, the more I find to be a thing of real wisdom. It is astonishing how that many minds working over that many years can really produce something that is extraordinarily powerful. And it achieves its power, the 2003 convention, by being flexible. And that I find extraordinary, because most legislative instruments are designed not to be flexible. They prescribe. So I don't have questions at the moment for each of the three of you, but I think together, collectively, you've set out precisely that trajectory. And I think Susanne's final talk shows just how far things have come, and extraordinary potential. And I think a lot will come out of this meeting in Naples later on this year, where the conventions sit down in a sense and have perhaps a prenuptial conversation, to use Gamini's metaphor.
Thank you, Chris. So do you have any other reply or for the Chris comment? Yeah, Mr. Gamini, so please start. And put the microphone on.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. Thank you for those wonderful presentations. Just a quick question to Susanne. You know about this list. Even the 72 convention intends to prepare their national inventories. That is the main focus. But the rush is for the World Heritage List. I think there is even no recognition for the what they call tentative list at UNESCO level, except that they put it on their website. How do you see the 2003 convention working? You emphasize on the list, national list, I think, which is very important. I think I'll tell you even later, we had long discussions as to how we can encourage the national list. So you have this thing, you have the national list, and of course you also have this international list. I'm not sure how competitive it is and how the state parties are rushing for that. But I want to ask, my question is, how are you recognizing that national list being prepared by the state parties? I think that's a very important point. That's why I'm asking. Hope it's clear.
Shall I answer? Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you very much for this question, Gamini. It is indeed a very important one. So I think there are a few things to say about this. The list, I mean, one reason why we rolled out this capacity building program was also to make sure that at the country level, states, parties, communities, all the stakeholders become aware that this is about trying to identify and inventorying as much as possible. It's not like it's intangible cultural heritage exists in abundance. It's not about the exceptional, it's about what we all live, what is part of our humanity. So the logic is actually not to single out something. So the lists are not intended to do that. The lists are intended to raise awareness, but in no hierarchical manner, in our capacity building program, as you know, we emphasize a lot the importance of identification at the country level. We even say more than one list. We even don't necessarily say national list, because it's very important to see there can be more than one inventory, and it is community-based and community-driven. So the methodology that is being applied is that. Now, to be able to inscribe something on the international list, you already have to be part of the inventories that exist at the country level. But if you like, more inscriptions does not go against the logic of the convention, which is recognizing living heritage in abundance. But there is a limit to human capacity and institutional capacity to inscribe, because, as you know, it's a very thorough process that we have an evaluation body that looks at all the files. The members look at it individually, 12 members, then they also look at it collectively. They have to agree. And it's not to say, is this intangible cultural heritage or not? It is about the criteria that are behind the two lists to see. And then the committee, of course, is the body that the states parties take the decision. So in that sense, it's a bit different than the logic behind the list of the World Heritage Convention. What we found has helped also a lot is a dialogue process that was introduced for inscriptions in the intangible in the 2003 convention, when there were evaluations of files and there are some specific questions open. There's also possibility for dialogue before the evaluation body makes its recommendation, and it also helps then, of course, the committee to take its decision. Now, Gamini, I don't know if that answers your question. I would be interested. Maybe it's more conversation. I would be interested what you think of what I just said.
Thank you very much, Gamini and Susanne. But I'm sorry that it's about time to wrap up the Q&A session. So Thank you very much.
Now, let's move on to the next group of presenters. Our next speaker is Miss Naomi Faik-Simet, Assistant Director for Dance from the Institute of Papua New Guinea Studies. She has been involved in researching Papua New Guinea's dance tradition for over 20 years. Papua New Guinea has ratified the convention, but the country has no ICH elements inscribed on the list yet, and it has now been actively involved in strengthening ICH practices in local communities. In her presentation, she will share with us the work undertaken by the Institute of Papua New Guinea Studies and the National Cultural Commission in the safeguarding of ICH. I will give you the floor, Ms. Naomi Simet.
So my title is Safeguarding ICH in Papua New Guinea, a reflection on 20 years of work at the Institute of Papua New Guinea Studies. For those of you who don't know where Papua New Guinea is, next slide, please. It's just above Australia, has a population of about 8 million people, 800 plus indigenous languages and ethnic groups, one of the most diverse countries. I think it is the most diverse, culturally diverse country in the world, categorized into 4 main regions. We have the highlands, the northern Momase, southern Papua, and the New Guinea Islands. Thank you. Next screen. So this gives you an indication or some sort of idea of the diversity that I'm talking about. And when it comes to ICH, it's even more complex because we are looking at different ethnicities and understanding the different practices relating to ICH practice. Next slide, please. So the 2003 UNESCO Convention on Safeguarding Intangible Cultural Heritage, the government of Papua New Guinea ratified the convention through the PNG National Cultural Commission in 2008. I'd like to acknowledge Ms. Noriko Aikawa, I think in the former, under the former leadership of Dr. Simet and Ms. Hale Lahui, staff of the National Cultural Commission worked hard to get this convention ratified for PNG. And so far, I must honestly say that attempts are still going to undertake research and inventory to safeguard particular ICH in PNG, given the complexity of the situation with the administrative issues that we faced, and the current management under the leadership of our good executive director, Mr. Stephen Inom Kilanda, who is now heading the commission, is picking up on some of the projects that are relating to ICH. Next slide, please. So for me, I work with the Institute of Papua New Guinea Studies, which was a very old government research institute established in 1974 under the Cultural under the Cultural Development Act, which was then administered by the National Cultural Council. So the Institute of PNG Studies is at present a government cultural research institute under the National Cultural Commission after the establishment of the NCC 1994 Act. Next slide, please. So we basically, the main function of our institute, we've been doing ICH research prior to the ratification of the 2003 convention. Our archives and our collection basically holds the largest music traditions, and now dance is adding onto the collection with ethnology, oral history, and it's the only archive in PNG that contains the traditions on ICH in these 4 areas, the 4 divisions that are currently functioning at the Institute of PNG Studies: ethnology, music, dance, and we have the publication. Next slide, please. So ethnographic and cultural research on dance in Papua New Guinea began in 2001. But beyond that, there were research undertaken also on dance in Papua New Guinea. And when I took over in 2001, I continued the work on establishing, now we've got a separate dance division, which came into effect in 2021, only recently. Next slide, please. So when the Cultural Commission ratified the convention in 2008, they were exploring possibilities of which particular ICH can be put on the UNESCO listing. One of the attempts that they made was looking at the Krakubandi female initiation practiced by the Yangit people in the East Sepik province of Papua New Guinea. So this particular initiation promotes women, economic and community empowerment, cultural sustainability, and continuity of traditional knowledge and ICH practices. So the first attempt to inscribe this ICH for UNESCO listing was done in 2011, and we are revisiting this attempt with other ICH that are now also being promoted and safeguarded and supported by the National Cultural Commission. Next slide, please. So one of the key outcomes of this work was the published work on that I'd like to share in this presentation on the Krakubandi female initiation. So I tried to make this ceremony, I tried to make its importance understood in publications. So this resulted in the work that I did there, going back to 2009. Next slide, please. And today, the ceremony is still continuing. We are having the Sepik Plain Saksak Festival, which is supported by the National Cultural Commission. It will take place in December from the 15th to the 16th of December, promoting sustainable tourism and economic empowerment. And the festival is supported by the National Cultural Commission and East Sepik provincial government. So there's a bit of economic sustainability there, which still has some potential of for inscription. Next slide, please. And then we have under the new management of Mr. Kilanda and his good team at the National Cultural Commission, they are now continuing the work on safeguarding the festivals that provided that space for identification of certain ICH elements in Papua New Guinea. So the Eharo mass culture is one of those very, very significant mass culture that is still supported by Cultural Commission. So the current research on the Eharo done this year is undergoing Miss Apuka, Dorish Apuka, who was a former officer with the UNESCO, is currently with the National Cultural Commission looking into the possibility of getting this mass culture also listed on the UNESCO list. So these are some of the updates that I'd like to share, as I am not directly involved in the process, as I'm doing technical work with the Institute of Papua New Guinea Studies. Next slide, please. And this is some of the publications on the Eharo Mask, which qualifies the need for such activities to be safeguarded in a time of globalization, where many of our cultures in Papua New Guinea are being at the verge of disappearing or at the verge of being hybridized, or contemporized. So we are looking at, since we've ratified the convention, we want to identify this ICH to help safeguard the authenticity of these practices. Next slide, please. And these are some of the ICH work done by other staff like Professor Don Niles, who is now our consultant with the Institute of PNG Studies. He's done a lot of work and involvement in ICH matters. Next slide, please. And also I am now continuing some of that work For Cultural Commission and the Institute of PNG Studies, as you can see, I participated in the Second Pacific meeting of the Convention of Safeguarding Intangible Cultural Heritage in Tonga from the 2nd to the 4th December, organized by UNESCO office up here. So all these meetings have helped give us an understanding of what is needed to get our inventories up and running. So in 2009, also, I attended a 8-day ACCU International Partnership Program for Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage, training course for safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage. Both Ms. Halela Hui and I attended this in Kyoto. Next slide, please. And these are some of the publications that came out of the recent IRCI. After the ratification, we were tasked to contribute to this book in traditional knowledge and wisdom, themes from the Pacific Islands. And we got these authors, 4 authors that are listed there, to contribute on certain ICH practices from PNG that still remain very strong. Thank you. Next slide. So currently, I've been involved in the International Research Center for Intangible Cultural Heritage in the Asia Pacific region, IRCI in Osaka. I've been involved in some of the research projects on ICH affected by the COVID-19 pandemic in East New Britain. So this research has been has started in 2021, and it's still continuing on in my final stage of the project, writing up the research results and data analysis for publication, which will be produced by IRCI in March 2024. So I am right at the end of this project. And in 2022, our colleagues from NCC, Ms. Dorish Apuka, has also been contracted from the National Cultural Commission, has been contracted by the IRCI for another IRCI-related ICH project on sustainable research data collection for ICH safeguarding, focusing on the Central Asia and small island development states. So in this project, Ms. Apuka is liaising with the Institute of PNG Studies to put together ICH bibliography listing based on the ICH that was published in the past. So that's another project that we are working with IRCI. Next slide, please. And then I just completed my doctoral thesis on exploring Buai as a pedagogical knowledge system for teaching and learning creativity amongst the Tolai of Papua New Guinea in 2021. So I'm happy that in the presentation by Noriko and the others, the first session, we touched a bit on creativity. That's one aspect that we'd like to look at in Papua New Guinea, where at the Institute of PNG Studies, where we also promote preservation of ICH and archival in book publications, but also working closely with the practitioners in their communities and helping them continue that process of safeguarding where ICH can be transmitted properly in its rightful form across generations. And creativity is one aspect to tap into and explore in the research that we are doing at the Institute of PNG Studies. Next slide, please. So in this research, basically, meanings of creativity, according to Tenaboy of East New Britain, has been the focus of the study, looking into the master teachers, where East New Britain referred to them as the Tenaboys, the master knowledge holders of the practice. So I'm happy that, it's so fortunate to see that in the convention, these practitioners can be supported, and the access, a challenging part is the access to those knowledge holders, which we are also experiencing in our context. So next slide, please. And one of the advocacy activities that I was involved in was the inclusion of indigenous dance pedagogies in tertiary learning context. So looking at how identifying knowledge practitioners and the knowledge that they teach in their village communities and how that can be transferred or adapted into formal learning education contexts. So one of the very problematic area in PNG that we are battling with at the moment, but I think more awareness around this still needs to be done. And we had a successful project going from July to September last year. And most of the students were able, and the teachers were able to support this initiative of looking at bringing back cultural content from secondary, primary, right up to tertiary learning spaces, formal learning spaces. Next slide, please. So we're moving into engaging with other institutions like the University of Auckland. Lately, the University of Auckland signed a letter of understanding with the faculty, particularly the Faculty of Creative Arts and Industries, University of Auckland, signed a letter of understanding with the Institute of PNG Studies and the National Cultural Commission to foster international research partnership to support dance, culture, and art education scholarship. And that's where ICH can give its place in such partnerships when it comes to research, academic research, and training new researchers from PNG to look into fields of ICH as well. So we achieved this on the 25th of August this year. And as you can see, that's our executive director, actually, Mr. Stephen Kilanda, actually signing that agreement. So that's like one way of implementing the convention, I must say, but also awareness, a lot of awareness around ICH in these developments. Next slide, please. So most of our work is governed by the National Cultural Commission Act of 1994. And we recently launched our national cultural policy in 2023 last year in June. So the policy captures is from 2022 to 2032. And then we also have the NCC 5-year cultural strategic plan, 2022 to 2026. And of course, the traditional knowledge and expressions of culture, draft policy. And then we've got the 2003 UNESCO Convention on Safeguarding Intangible Cultural Heritage. So these are the legislations and policies that guide and support our work at the national level when it comes to ICH. Next slide. So I think that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you, Tomas. Olgeta.
Now we invite Ms. Zaha Ahmed, Assistant Architect and Acting Head of Heritage Section of the National Center for Cultural Heritage in Maldives. Maldives have made multiple efforts to preserve and conserve the country's cultural heritage, but most of the work focused tangible cultural heritage. Maldives have not ratified the 2003 convention, but with the assistance of UNESCO, the government of the Maldives is currently working on this. In this presentation, she is talking about progress and challenges in safeguarding ICH in the Maldives. The floor is yours, Ms. Ahmed.
Good evening, everyone, and my name is Zaha, and I will be giving you a presentation about our progress and challenges in the Maldives of safeguarding intangible cultural heritage. And in my presentation, the first part of the presentation, I'll give you a brief explanation about the intangible cultural heritage of the Maldives. And the next part, I'll be explaining about the various work, the attempts we have done in working towards ratifying the 2003 convention. And at last, I'll be sharing our challenges and our way forward. So Maldives, according to archaeological evidence, it is proven that Maldives is more than 2,500 years old. And during the ancient time, the location of the Maldives has made the country a famous transit point for the seafarers crossing from east to west and vice versa. Sometimes the people make stopovers due to shipwrecks or due to the weather, and they stay for over months. And during this time, it gave opportunity to exchange knowledge, techniques, and even tradition. So what we witness today in Maldives is our intangible cultural heritage. We find a mix of culture and traditions. And also we have many of our traditions and cultural practices influenced from prior religions. And from archaeological evidence, we know that there have been existence of Buddhism as well as Hinduism before the country embracing Islam in 1153. So it's very common to find shrines and tombs in the island, and there are rituals and belief associated with these structures. And some of these rituals later on were considered to be contradicting with our religious belief, Islamic values. So the Maldivian government have banned some of these practices. So some of these rituals have been stopped, like people give offerings to these shrines, and these things were asked to stop. So the management of these sites were, many people stopped visiting the site. So it really took a toll in managing some of the cultural heritage sites in the Maldives. And another thing is this religious chanting or gatherings that took place, which was considered as something that was opposing to the religious, but there were some social activity that came together with this these rituals, like there is these festivals, feasts that happen, and there was so much social interaction that stopped, which was still socially acceptable, but have been stopped because these festivals are not being continued now. And also usually to carry out this festival, island people gather to one of this island, and they build temporary sheds. And this work itself helps to disseminate many traditional knowledge and enhance the technical skill set, and helps in transmission of this ICH. And also there is a change of rule from monarchy to democracy in Maldives. And now from during the monarchy period, there is a certain set of ways that people used to live, but now it is not practiced. So because of the democracy, so these ways of life, the things they have used, how the classes at that time is like a distant memory now. So these are the things that is considered as intangible cultural heritage in the Maldives. And because our country is an archipelago nation, and there are over 200 islands people are living in, each island has a different set of cultural specialties and expertise. So it is actually a challenge to compile even a list of ICH in the Maldives. So next part, I'll be giving you a brief walkthrough of the work we have done in working toward to ratify the 2003 convention. So we have been ratified in the 1972 convention. So we are very familiar with the World Heritage Convention, because we have been working towards in nominating the coral stone mosques of the Maldives in the World Heritage list. So we've been working very closely with the UNESCO, and during our meetings, the UNESCO came to know that Maldives have done very limited work on ICH. So at that time, in November 2016, the UNESCO New Delhi office offered us to carry out an awareness raising workshop, giving an introduction to us about the 2003 convention of ICH. And in this workshop, government officials as well as individual researchers and NGOs took part in. And just after this workshop, an ICH committee was established. And the main objective of this committee was to compile a list of ICH of the Maldives, and to have an inventory, because it was supposed to be the first step when we are when we are moving forward for this ratification process. So this ICH committee consists of mostly of government officials and very few individual researchers. So what we noticed was, we came on doing the list based on the 5 domains, and the list can go on, and we found that we were a bit lost in the work, and we again asked the UNESCO New Delhi office to help us, to guide us, because the list became endless when we started to do the listing. So they shared their experience where we need to involve more NGOs. We have to work more closely with the community, and it cannot be achieved just sitting here in a meeting room. The listing cannot be done. So in 2019 April, a follow-up workshop that was from UNESCO organized in Maldives to gather the stakeholders to discuss about the methodology, like what kind of method will be more suitable for us, especially because traveling takes time and we have limited NGOs. So this workshop focused more on giving information to focus to involve NGOs. But unfortunately, it was we were not able to get many NGOs to actively participate in this workshop. So it took it slowed down a bit, and in 2019, the Cultural Heritage Act of the Maldives was enacted, which enforces to maintain inventory of both tangible and intangible cultural heritage lists, which needs to be updated periodically. So due to this act, we started again working on this listing, and this time we worked with the island councils, and this current administration Ministry of Arts, Culture and Heritage was established, and our minister presented a paper in July 2020 regarding Maldives to ratify the 2003 Convention of Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage. And we got one ministry reservation in the convention. Then that was the Ministry of Islamic Affairs. And the reservation they had is many of our traditions and cultural practices were some which were stopped, and if we are going to educate, they fear that in future these might be something the future generation might start to practice, and they do not want to revert back to the pre-Islamic period. And Maldives being 100% Muslim country, it became a very sensitive issue. So still discussion between the stakeholders are ongoing. And at the time being, we are working with the island councils by sending forms to fill out to get the inventory list ongoing. And we found out that the councils replied us listing the tangible cultural heritage. We got list of ancient mosques and places rather than about the traditional knowledge, their dances or I say. So we knew that we need to conduct an awareness session. So in November 2020, So later that year, in December 2020, we conducted an online awareness session to spread information about ICH listing to the Island Council. So it was a quite successful awareness session where people understood the difference between the tangible and intangible and the reason why we are doing it. And now at this time, Maldives is working toward for cultural tourism, and island councils are very much in need of having their identity and to have their own narrative. So it really gave them the opportunity, this drive, to send us those information. And in August 2021 and 2022, we continued gathering information, and we have compiled now an inventory, and it consists of 166 elements received from 69 islands. And the latest work we have done is actually with the IRCI. We have signed an agreement from April 2023 to March 2024. And in this, we are compiling the sustainable research data collection for ICH safeguarding. And this work also helped us to work closely with the stakeholder and understand all the research work done in this area. So this is my last part of my presentation, where I'll be briefing you about the challenges we face. One of the things is lack of resources. We have very few established NGOs, mostly the committed NGOs. There are few NGOs, they conduct like capacity building program for thatch weaving, but in Maldives, it's difficult to travel and it is very expensive so it's very difficult to conduct these training sessions, especially the practitioners are not familiar with the current maybe online session. It's difficult to conduct, so we have to go physically and gather the people to conduct the capacity building programs. But recently we have begun giving small, under the Cultural Heritage Act, there is the Cultural Heritage Trust Fund. From that, we are giving small funds for the island councils to carry out such capacity building programs for the local to revive and transmit the ICH. And the other thing is scattered island, which I have highlighted just now. It is very difficult because we are stationed in the center reaching the island council and communicating, and again reaching back to the practitioners and the community is very difficult, because we need to find a way to work together, and that is what we're trying to now trying to have a good network. And during the COVID period, we did a listing of the practitioners, and we are trying to have a good communication with them. And in 2021, I worked with one of the local practitioner of lacquer worker. We did a presentation in each CAP seminar together. So these are some of the things we do to have a better relationship with the communities and the practitioners. And the third one is the religious concern in educating cultural practices prior to Islam or contradicting with Islam. And this is something which is very sensitive and which we are trying to talk, and I think this is the most difficult one we are trying to overcome. And the fourth one is the lack of awareness, and the last thing I would like to say, like how we plan our way forward, is first we are trying to validate and publish an ICH inventory, and we are trying to establish like a portal where people could comment on it, and even the locals and everybody could give input in completing the inventory. And the second is we need to conduct awareness session at different level. We need to identify why we are doing safeguarding ICH, and this should come from the community level. This should be done in the decision making level, because this is how we can work towards in achieving the goals. And the last one is we plan to work toward to get ratified, and we believe if more people are going to voice out, if more people understand the benefits of ratifying, we'll be able to successfully achieve it. Thank you very much.
Our last speaker is Mr. Lucas Lixinski, a professor in Faculty of Law and Justice, University of New South Wales, Sydney. Australia has not ratified the 2003 Convention, largely because it ties to the ongoing process of constitutional recognition of Indigenous peoples in the country. Nonetheless, some states in the Australian Federation have taken steps to implement the Convention. In his presentation entitled Intangible Cultural Heritage in Australia, Federalism and the Lure of Indigeneity, Mr. Lixinski will look into the tension surrounding this treaty in Australian law and politics, critiquing the assumption in Australia that intangible cultural heritage is exclusively Indigenous heritage and the praise of intangible heritage in Indigenous recognition processes. Let's welcome Mr. Lixinski.
Thank you for having me in this session. It's been wonderful to see so many of my heroes live and learn from all of you. So in the next 18 minutes or so, I would like to talk to you about what's going on in Australia. And essentially, the way I want to proceed with this is just a brief introduction and talk specifically about what's going on in Australia in relation to the Intangible Heritage Convention, and then tease out two of the big themes that speak to Australia's position in this area, which are namely the role of federalism in the country, and also the connection to indigeneity and Indigenous peoples' recognition processes in the country. Now, in terms of an introduction, Australia has not ratified Intangible Heritage Convention, as you probably know well, but some states in Australia, and that's the bit you may not know so well, is that some states in Australia, a federal country, have quote unquote implemented the Intangible Heritage Convention nonetheless. In these implementation efforts from some states that we will discuss in more detail later, one of the big themes that comes across is this connection between intangible heritage and Indigenous identity and Indigenous heritage. To put it quite bluntly, the position in Australia is that only Indigenous peoples have intangible heritage, or that intangible cultural heritage is something that is reserved for Indigenous peoples. A position that I think is both wrong and dangerous, as I will explain further. And my argument today, or the one thing I want to try to convince you of in this presentation, is that ratification of the Intangible Heritage Convention should be in Australia about more than Indigenous peoples, important as Indigenous identity is, but also that Australia, and I think everyone can learn from the experience of Indigenous heritage and push harder on the control aspects that surround intangible heritage, and how the Intangible Heritage Convention can work as a mechanism to enhance control over that heritage by the communities that create it and keep it alive and relevant. Now, in terms of Australia specifically and Intangible Heritage Convention, Australia is one of 13 member states of UNESCO that is not a party to this treaty. And there are many explanations out there for that. Whenever you ask the Australian government, they give you a slightly different explanation. But many of these explanations boil down to the connection between intangible heritage and Indigenous peoples. Now, Indigenous peoples in Australia They're about 2.5% of the population in the country, and they have long been struggling for different forms of recognition. Most recently, something that happened this year that I'll come back to in a minute. And a lot of this recognition has been grounded in culture, as is often the case with any kind of indigenous recognition process around the world, right? So the idea is that indigenous peoples have special rights on the basis of the distinctiveness of their culture. And in this space, intangible cultural heritage serves as a mechanism to prove the existence of this culture, make it visible, and therefore leverage all sorts of other claims for recognition, from land to economic resources to, as is the case now in the current debates in Australia, political recognition as well. There are a few problems, however, with this connection to indigeneity. First of all, as I already mentioned, it's conceptually wrong, right? The Intangible Heritage Convention was drafted very much on purpose to not just be about indigenous heritage and indigenous peoples. And that's the reason why there's only one reference to indigenous peoples in the entire treaty, and that's in the preamble. Otherwise, the idea is that everyone has intangible heritage of some sort. And it is because everyone has intangible heritage that we should all come and appreciate each other's intangible heritages, right? Once you make intangible heritage belonging only with a certain segment of the population, it's very easy to use that intangible heritage to create a quote-unquote other that it becomes very easy to compartmentalize and then dismiss. And that's what I fear happens in Australia whenever they only make the connection, whenever you mention intangible heritage and people only connect it to indigenous identity and indigenous peoples. So that's where we're at in Australia and the Intangible Heritage Convention more generally. But of course, there are also some issues around federalism that I promised we would discuss. And let me start with the federal government side of things, which is relatively easy, which is to say there's not much happening there, right? So the federal government has been largely inert in this area, but at the end of 2021, there was the result of this inquiry by the federal government on the destruction of the Juukan Gorge sites, which is a site of great significance to indigenous peoples in Australia. They were destroyed by a mining company who had not broken the law. They did consultation with indigenous peoples in the area. The problem is that the requirements for that consultation under Australian federal Indigenous heritage law were very low. And then therefore this whole thing happened. There was a lot of outcry, a lot of pushback, and therefore there was this inquiry by the federal parliament in Australia, which said that the destruction by the mining company was excused. And what was to blame here was the inaptitude of Australian heritage legislation, which is split across both federal legislation and state legislation, with the primary role being for the states. And what the government said, what the Senate inquiry said is that, look, we've given states so many chances to do this well. They have failed every single time. Enough is enough. Now we need to federalize Indigenous heritage legislation. And part of this effort to federalize Indigenous heritage legislation should be also to ratify the Intangible Heritage Convention, because that will implement better avenues for consultation with Indigenous populations and Indigenous peoples. That sounds lovely, except that it doesn't quite understand, or it misunderstands how the Intangible Heritage Convention works, because it's putting too much pressure on it as a solution to all problems of Australian Indigenous heritage law, one of which I think, again, is fundamentally this problem that Indigenous heritage law in the country is separate from all other heritage law. And that makes it very easy to compartmentalize indigenous interests, to the point where I would suggest to you, in Australia, there are two different logics operating when it comes to the intersection between cultural heritage and development. When we talk about non-indigenous or mainstream, quote unquote, cultural heritage, the logic is that cultural heritage must be protected and development is an exception to it. On the other hand, when it comes to the operation of indigenous heritage legislation in this country, it seems that the reverse applies. And the idea is that, therefore, development should be the rule, and occasionally we will protect indigenous cultural heritage instead. And that's a direct result of the separation between the two types of heritage, in my opinion, and it showcases why that should not happen whether at the state or federal government, federal levels. So in revising and overhauling indigenous cultural heritage law in this country, I think the federal government would do well, yes, to ratify the Intangible Heritage Convention, but also to make intangible heritage law about all of heritage and to unify heritage law in this country. So that's what's happening at the federal level. At the state level, a number of states in Australia, there are only 6 states in Australia, plus 2 territories. But you can see here 3 of the states in some version and 1 of the territories, which is the Australian Capital Territory, ACT, have talked about intangible heritage and have, quote unquote, attempted, at least, if not actually implemented, the Intangible Heritage Convention, but always only in the context of indigenous heritage legislation. And here the focus has been very much on a version of intangible heritage that is closer to intellectual property law and intellectual property interests. So it's very much about the registration of intangible heritage and protecting that heritage from misappropriation, all of which are very valid concerns, but it relies on a logic of intellectual property that is very distinctive from the logic of the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention. As you well know, despite Article 3B of the Intangible Heritage Convention, they are very different sets of interests. And as a result of this reliance on intellectual property mechanisms is that we tend to be overcorrecting and giving too much control over intangible heritage in a way that stifles cultural creation. I'm not saying communities shouldn't control their heritage. I'm very much in favor of control, but the logic of property and intellectual property does not always work for other interests like mutual and other objectives of the convention, like, enhancing visibility and mutual respect and appreciation and all of those things. So that's what where we are in Australia in terms of federalism. We have different solutions here, which will ultimately, hopefully, converge around the federal initiatives and federal legislation. So what does that mean, again, for broader recognition processes for Indigenous peoples? Well, in Australia, we're working through a recognition process that started with the Uluru Statement from the Heart in 2017, which is a broader context asking for constitutional change for better recognition of Indigenous peoples in the Australian Constitution. Indigenous peoples in Australia, like elsewhere in the world, they suffer from worse socioeconomic outcomes than the average population. So they die younger, they have worse health, worse education, higher unemployment, higher incarceration rates, and so on and so on. And a big part of it is just the fact that Indigenous peoples are not particularly visible, according to a lot of Indigenous advocates. So the big push here is to promote change in the Constitution to allow for Indigenous peoples to be better seen and to have more control over their destinies. And one big initiative was the creation of an Indigenous voice to Parliament, which was to create an institution that would promote Indigenous rights. So rather than just having Indigenous rights as a declaration, which would then be hard to enforce, the idea was to create an actual institution composed of Indigenous people and representing indigenous peoples that would push for those rights and enforce them. But in Australia, in order to change the constitution, we need a referendum, we need a vote of the entire population, and we held that on October 14th, so just before the 20th anniversary of the Intangible Heritage Convention, and that referendum unfortunately failed, which means that we will not create a voice of parliament enshrined in the constitution, and this big move that was leveraged again on cultural difference and the visibility of culture like intangible cultural heritage will not come to fruition. And now indigenous advocates are mourning, first of all, very understandably, but also regrouping and thinking of other forms of culture-based advocacy to promote indigenous sovereignty. And in this space, again, intangible cultural heritage and recognition of intangible cultural heritage is likely to play a central role. But one of the reasons why, arguably, this referendum was failed is because we don't, a lot of Australians don't know indigenous people. So it's very hard to create a boogie person and to, again, compartmentalize indigenous interests as opposed to relate to them on a basic human empathetic kind of level. And in this sense, to perpetuate this myth that that intangible heritage is only for indigenous peoples allows the perpetuation of this lack of knowledge, right? Oh yeah, intangible heritage sounds cute, but it's something that only indigenous peoples have, and it's not something that I should concern myself with. That's the logic that currently prevails in Australia. Whereas I would argue that the opposite, which is to say everyone, indigenous and non-indigenous populations, have intangible heritage, will lead to greater appreciation and greater visibility to intangible heritage across the board, including for indigenous peoples, and that will benefit future advocacy for indigenous rights in the country. So what do we do now? I think the Australian experience with the Intangible Heritage Convention can teach us a lot about important things in thinking about the future of the Intangible Heritage Convention around the world. First of all, it's the way in which intangible heritage can be used as minority protection tactics in many contexts, more or less successfully. Secondly, that intangible cultural heritage can be narrowed down and in this process almost being weaponized against minorities as well. So we need to be very careful with how we play the use of intangible cultural heritage for minority cultures. Yes, it is something important to minority cultures, but it's also something that everyone has and everyone should care about, much like everyone should care about minorities. Thirdly, that it is important that competences around culture be shared across all government levels. And finally, is to really drive home the centrality of control for ICH safeguarding. The importance of safeguarding intangible cultural heritage, in my view, is to benefit those communities, groups, and sometimes individuals who create and keep alive the wondrous thing that is intangible cultural heritage and all those beautiful manifestations. But if they cannot control those manifestations or those elements of intangible heritage, that heritage is more likely to be in trouble. So let's promote control. And that's all I had. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to our discussion.
Now, all presentation of the second group are done. And again, I would like to invite Mr. Ishimura to have a short Q&A session with Ms. Simet, Ms. Ahmed, and Mr. Lixinski, and all other panelists, and to moderate the rest of the program, including the commentators' comment and the general discussion afterwards. So from here on, the floor is all yours, Mr. Ishimura.
Thank you very much, Ms. Simet, Ms. Ahmed, and Mr. Lixinski for your wonderful speeches. Firstly, I'd like to say a few comments. Ms. Simet explained PNG's effort to the implementation of the 2003 convention. As she mentioned, I totally agree that the PNG is one of the most culturally diverse countries on this planet. Comparing to other countries, this complexity may also make it difficult to implement the convention, such as the inventorying and the nomination of ICH elements. But I really congratulate your effort in the last 20 years, and I believe your practice and experience are worth being shared worldwide. Ms. Ahmed introduced the State Party of the Maldives' effort toward the ratification of the 2003 conventions, as well as the diverse culture and the rich element of the ICH in the Maldives. The Maldives is in the important position geographically connecting the east and west of the Indian Ocean. And I believe that visualizing its ICH will also be beneficial for the promotion and the development of the ICH in the surrounding area around the Indian Ocean. Ms. Lixinski report on the current situation and challenge for the ratification of the 2003 convention in Australia. Unfortunately, two major countries in the Pacific region, Australia and New Zealand, have yet to ratify the convention. But Australia is a country with rich ICH, and it can make a major contribution to the development and the promotion of this convention in the Pacific region, I believe. So that's all for my short comment. And now we would like to start a short Q&A session. I also would like to invite Chris again for commentator. Then, dear panelists, Ms. Shimet, Ms. Ahmed, Mr. Lixinski, and Mr. Ballard, please share any questions or comments you may have regarding the second three presentation. So please. I see no. So I observed that the PNG and Chris, please start.
Thank you. Just to make the point, which I'm sure most other people have observed, that all three speakers were talking about the challenges and the importance of different state levels of state institutions, and the importance of strategy in tackling ICH. I thought Zaha Ahmed's presentation was particularly telling in terms of the kind of almost, I won't say underground, but the careful navigation that has to be engaged with to deal with all of the ministries engaged and their kind of particular interests, and making sure that they don't become adversaries to the process. So the need to recruit in Papua New Guinea amongst the various institutions and to deploy the regulations that you have, the need to work between the federal and state governments in Australia. And I thought in particular in the Maldives, this move towards the island councils, which I think is a really important step, this kind of devolution of not just powers, but kind of cultural authority almost to engage in what's meaningful at a local level, and perhaps to draw less attention from the federal or the central state to what's happening, points perhaps to the way in which some of that strategy might be achieved. But it seemed to be a common thread in all three papers. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. So other panelists, do you have a recommend for Chris?
Yeah, I just wanted to say something about this conversation between the central government levels and local government levels, because it's fascinating how, yeah, in the Maldives, it's all about pushing towards the local, But in Australia, where they had pushed towards the local, right? It's this idea, okay, the local has actually failed us. So the federal government is kind of stepping in. And I don't think the solution is an either or, right? I think all levels should be interested. But I think as far as we want to allow the Intangible Heritage Convention to set the basic parameters of the conversation, we probably do need a very strong, not in the sense of prescriptive, of the everyday detail, but we need to have very clear boundaries set by national legislation as to how intangible heritage is used, right? And how minority and how the different groups, right, cultural creators, CGIs, benefit from it and can use it for other political goals, and then devolve that power locally, right? Because when it comes to culture, the best work, in my opinion, is always done locally, but we need the central government on board because that's the communication channel with UNESCO, technically, as far as I can see.
Thank you, Lucas. So maybe I would like to, yeah, please, Ms. Ahmed.
Yes, I would also like to thank Mr. Chris and Mr. Lucas for the comments. And in Maldives, yes, we have tried several ways, like we tried to work with the NGOs and it didn't accomplish. And now I think working with the local council is a step forward, especially because the islands are working towards introducing the local tourism, and it's becoming very competitive between the islands, because before 2008 the tourism is only being in tourist islands. In local inhabited islands, it's not allowed to have guest house. Only after 2008 it's allowed to have guest house in the local islands. So now the local islands are getting economic benefits for tourists coming in, because earlier time the tourists used to stay in those resorts only. So now it is a time that the island communities are taking pride in their culture and their identity, and I think this is the right time that we are making this effort, and I hope more people coming in, we can come stronger in ratifying the convention. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaha. So Naomi, do you have something to say?
Yes, for PNG, although we have ratified the convention, I think our challenges remain, and we are addressing those with the National Cultural Commission as I shared in my presentation, identifying certain social practices or ceremonies, festivals that are currently being promoted in our mandated duty, in our act, which really also caters for ICH related activities, which makes it a bit easier. And having ratified the convention is just for us to maybe come back to UNESCO and ask for more capacity building workshops, training maybe, to look at inventory making. That's something at our stage can be overwhelming, dealing with understanding practices which are quite complex and diverse. And I think that's an ongoing challenge that we at the Institute of PNG Studies and the Cultural Commission are currently identifying in our normal mandated duties to preserve and document, research, publish. But when it comes to inventory, that's another level that we may need a bit of assistance from UNESCO. So that's just my concern when it comes to recommendations for future capacity building needs for PNG, for inventory making, particularly for ICH. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. So now it's about time to wrap up the Q&A session. So thank you very much for the panelists. Then now I would like to invite Mr. Chris Ballard again for his overall comment for the presentations. So, Chris, could you start?
Thank you, Ishimura-san. So we've had 6 fantastic presentations that have really charted the processes, the achievements of ICH at its institutional level and as a set of practices, right up to the last minute. Lucas was talking about, you know, a vote, a plebiscite that took place just last weekend. I want to now focus my comments, my very brief comments, on how we might look at these challenges in the past and flip them into thinking about challenges for the future. So Noriko Aikawa very carefully stepped out for us and emphasized the time and the energy that is required to negotiate instruments successfully. None of that happens quickly. In fact, you know, the rollout of the convention has been spectacularly fast, given that the process of arriving at the form of the convention was so extended in a sense. Gamini Wijesuriya reminded us that ICH, forms of ICH, have been acknowledged in other conventions, and particularly in the 1972 convention, through a whole series of instruments and institutions within that convention. But I think perhaps there we need to stress the difference between acknowledgement and the promotion of active engagement. Because one of the things looking through recently, a huge number of instruments within and beyond UNESCO, was to note how often there was a kind of token acknowledgement of ICH without it really being embedded. And when you think about it, each of these conventions has attracted particular forms of professionalism, particular sets of families, to use Gamini's, again, metaphor of a potential marriage. And so the marriage is not a simple one, because it still remains, even as people can see the logic of the reintegration of tangible and intangible cultural heritage, you're talking about 2 tribes that haven't thought in the same way for quite some time. And the process of conversation and the process of education across that boundary will still need to be extensive, despite the very encouraging signs on both sides. Susanne Schnuttgen's presentation, I think more than anything else that it did, it reminded me of the extraordinary breadth of engagement between the 2003 convention and other instruments and institutions, as well as states, parties, and communities. This is the flip side of flexibility. If you have a nice, open, flexible convention, you end up talking to everyone. And I thought it was really important that she called for recognition of the limitations of the human resources and of the institutions in terms of addressing basic functions like inventorying, let alone thinking down the line about safeguarding. And so the challenge there is also, where do we place our emphasis? How do we deliver, given the real limitations at an institutional level and confronted by all states parties? And that leads us straight to Naomi Faik-Simet's presentation, which is about this mismatch in Papua New Guinea between diversity and the resources to address that diversity. As my linguist colleagues at ANU never tire of reminding us, there is more linguistic diversity between between one end of New Guinea and the other end than there is between Portugal and Korea. Okay, so more diversity than in the entire continent of Europe and Asia together. Now, we can argue that linguistic diversity doesn't map onto cultural diversity exactly, but you get a sense of the scale of the challenge. And for a state that is challenged with so many other development goals, culture often falls off the radar. So how do we work with limited state capacity and limited resources? That, I think, is absolutely the central challenge that Naomi was directing us towards. I've talked already about Zaha Ahmed's beautiful presentation on both the amazing range of cultural influences on the Maldives, which are like this net strung across the Indian Ocean, picking up everything that passes in both directions, And also this challenge of balancing between state regulation of non-Islamic ICH and ICH practices. So an attempt really directly to intervene in the way that people practice ICH, even if the population is 100% Islamic. So truly a challenge there. And we'll come back and talk about, I think, the strategy of devolving powers to the island councils. And I thought your intervention, Zaha, on the question of tourism and the devolution of tourism and tourism benefits to island councils is a really interesting link. And then finally to Lucas's paper on this tension between federal and state governments and instruments. And actually that pointed to the need for education of all stakeholders. I mean, the broader Australian population needs to be educated about what ICH is, because this misconception about its link to indigeneity condemns it to a form of ICH that I don't think any of the rest of us would recognize, but also condemns it to becoming hostage to the kind of political debates circulating in Australia at the moment. It neither resolves those issues, nor can it directly challenge them. So can I just weave all of those presentations together in thinking about future challenges, how they might manifest in the future. One of the things that the Living Heritage Entity has been working on quite intensively for the last 6 or 7 years is the question of ICH and emergency, starting with disasters, moving on to conflict, and now on climate change. And what all of these forms of emergency do is to place ICH and the relationships between state and practitioners under enormous stress, okay? And between practitioners and their ICH, like vast stress tests. And of course, climate change is the biggest of those. The other thing that becomes painfully obvious is that no state has the capacity to actually implement its own emergency plans or climate change plans independently of communities and individuals. So communities and individuals actually possess an extraordinary power in this relationship, because implementation is going to be at the hands, albeit regulated by the state. The work is going to have to be done by communities, because it is beyond the capacity of any state, no matter how wealthy. And I think there's a real opening or an opportunity there for ICH, because we will be using ICH to do that. Knowledge of hazards, knowledge of conflict resolution, that won't be top down, that will be bottom up. So I think Susanne's pointing to this idea of, and it sounds very exciting, of a platform for practitioners is really the way to go. How do states, parties, and UNESCO facilitate this kind of practitioner to practitioner exchange and learning, and what are the resources needed at the grassroots level to pursue these strategies of inventorying and safeguarding, which surely those communities, and this is at the heart of the convention, know best how to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. So now we would like to move on to the general panel discussion. I'd like to invite here all the panelists and for the general discussion. So now, throughout the presentation and the discussion in this symposium, I'd like to ask all the panelists to make suggestion or opinion on the future prospect of the 2003 convention, especially focus on the future of the 2003 convention. So I'd like to ask the opinion one by one. Then, so first, Ms. Aikawa, can you start first?
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Mr. Ishimura. Well, what about the future of the convention? Now, we have many state parties, so it's the state to implement the convention, but how to monitor the implementation of the convention, that is the very important question. And UNESCO has been implementing some monitoring system, but there is a limit because it's the state party's responsibility, and UNESCO has no access, particularly to the community of the state parties, and that's a very big challenge. And how to have an access to the community of each state parties. That's a very important challenge. This is the first thing that I can think of, and then maybe I come back later.
Thank you very much. So then next, Gamini, can you start?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think thank you for all the presentations. And of course, I have 2 questions, but I don't know if I have time to do that. But my suggestion with regard to your specific question of future is about the marriage. I will tell you how my proposal for the marriage between nature and culture has been successful, because there was so much things that can be shared between nature sector and culture sector. Of course, they have their own specificities, but then there are things that can be shared. So this is the point of my proposal for marriage. If you read a little bit of some of the publications we have made on this linking nature and culture, or bridging the gaps, and some of the work being done by IUCN, the nature sector, and cultural heritage sectors of ICOMOS and the ICROM and so on, you will realize that they were too late to integrate, too late to marry anyway. That's what. So in terms of intangible and tangible, I think that the point is not to lose their own identities of these two, but then to share what can be done collectively to benefit from each other. As I said, as my throughout, the tangible sector has embraced intangibles, and sometimes you cannot separate them. In fact, in 2004, there was the World Heritage Committee meeting where UNESCO wanted the 2003 convention to be discussed. It was chaired by Tomo, the chief of Tongariro National Park. He was of course, representative of New Zealand, and he was the chair of the committee. In fact, he said, sorry, we don't divide between tangibles and intangibles. So there was not much discussion needed. That was a sort of idea that came up. So what I am saying is that still there are things that can benefit from each other. Therefore, they need to discuss. Now, just to give you one example, UNESCO formulated its own sustainable development policy. This is not the SDGs of UN. In the same year, that means started long before. In fact, sustainable development in the heritage sector has been discussing since 1997 in organizations like ICROM. But then somehow it entered into the World Heritage in 2015 with even skepticism and objections from the tangible heritage sector. But it was done by people working on the heritage sector, and it was more related to UNESCO's objectives, including human rights aspects and so on. But of course, it is good for the 2003 convention to look at that and then see if there is anything that can be learned, that can be shared. So as I said, my proposal for a marriage is for more a dialogue or platform or whatever you want to call to share So that will share the similarities while recognizing their own specificity, but that will benefit for the future. I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So next, Susanne, please.
Thank you very much. Well, we had the 20th anniversary celebration in Seoul, where we where different priority areas in relation to the convention were discussed, notably the relationship between living heritage and sustainable livelihoods, the relationship between living heritage, safeguarding, and nature, the relationship between living heritage, safeguarding, and education, and also living heritage in the digital environment. And from that, there was a vision statement that emerged, and I think it can guide us in many ways to do action that helps us to unleash this power of living heritage for sustainable development. The convention already has the operational directives. It is embedded in the larger in cultural policies in the declaration of Mondial Kult, which has made a plea for holistic cultural heritage policies, asking to create the synergies, the marriages between the convention. And as Gamini said, there's a lot to be shared, and that is what one also can focus on. And in fact, at the country level, all these things are in any case interconnected. I think that also came through in some of your deliberations. And so that is the reality, and the conventions should serve the reality. And okay, it's true, resources are also limited. On the other hand, if we manage to get new actors who are not yet in the intangible cultural heritage community enthusiastic and engaged, we can have an extraordinary multiplier effect. Here I'm talking about actors who are involved in climate change action or emergencies. And that is actually what our strategic approach now has been in the Secretariat. And yeah, at the same time, I think there's this, we have to look at the potential of digital technology to see how we can even further reinforce dialogue. As Noriko said, the importance also of having, and Chris, the dialogue between communities to get the voices heard. Also, the periodic reporting mechanism is a wonderful tool for monitoring. Really, it has been amazing what we have seen over the 3 last years with the cycles implementing the reform periodic report in Latin America, in Europe, and in the Arab states so far. And that also will help the countries to devise their roadmaps and better formulate also their needs towards UNESCO. I've also taken note, there was, Ms. Simet talked about capacity building. Exactly, that is the idea of the global capacity building program, to respond to your needs in a tailored way. And we have the international assistance mechanism. We try to continue fundraising according to the needs of that we hear at the country level. So thank you also for sharing that, and thank you to everybody for sharing your ideas and perspectives. It's so helpful to have an even more holistic picture of where we are, and as a consequence where we want to go in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanne. Then Naomi, please.
Yes, thank you. My suggestion for the future is the implementation stage, which I'd like to be involved in. And if UNESCO can work closely with state parties, for Papua New Guinea, it would be the PNG National Cultural Commission, to assess, monitor, and evaluate some of the assistance they've given to us in the past, but revisit what was done and what needs to be identified to progress from the last team that handled ICH matters. We have a new management in place, so many things are quite not understood, and we are learning. new staff taking on the task. So if it's a very important convention for like in many communities where the ICH holders also known as traditional knowledge holders, and the access point is the government organization or an NGO, a committee for that matter. So the access is very important, and it's a big convention that still needs to be digested and understood, even right down to the education system. So there's a lot of work in terms of publicity, resource materials, awareness at those different levels. But for Papua New Guinea, we are fortunate because we already mandated, as I mentioned in my presentation, and we can move forward with working with UNESCO in the monitoring process, as Noriko mentioned, and I fully agree with that. Just the monitoring programs and assessment evaluation down the line, going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. Then please, Zaha.
Thank you. And for Maldives, I would say, because we are working towards ratification, I think it would be very good in the future if we are able to work closely with other similar countries to share experience, because I think we can learn a lot, and we could find better ways to make our road towards ratification easier. So I think those countries who are working towards, maybe UNESCO could help us and seek us in a way that like sessions like this, it help us to see how other countries are doing and how they overcome the challenges. So that would be my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaha. Then please, Lucas.
Thank you. My wish for the future is two wishes, actually. One, universal ratification, and the second, I wish the Intangible Heritage Convention to change the way we think about heritage across the board. Specifically, I want us all to realize that all heritage is in fact intangible, right? To use one example from just outside the UNESCO building, sure, the Eiffel Tower is beautiful, but it doesn't stand on its own, right? The reason we care about the Eiffel Tower is reasons like, you know, what it says about engineering, but also it's all the beautiful walks we had, the kisses we shared under it, and all of that, right? So it is those relationships that make heritage valid, that make heritage matter. And in this sense, heritage matters not for itself. It matters because it says something about humanity, the humanity we were, the humanity we are, and the humanity we want to be. And we can only really understand that if we understand that all heritage is in fact intangible. And I think because of that, the Intangible Heritage Convention and the many ways in which it encourages us to rethink everything we've ever known about heritage before 2003 should prevail over every other UNESCO treaty on culture. And I think we should all take it very seriously across the board. So that's kind of what I would like to see happen in the future.
Thank you, Lucas. So, Chris, do you say something? Say a few words?
Essentially, I've said my piece, but and I totally endorse what Lucas had to say at the end there, but I'm not sure that's the way to enter into a marriage. So again, it comes back to questions of strategy and knowing what to say and precisely when.
Thank you very much for you all. So, because of the time constraint, I cannot follow all of your opinion, but I'm very consider that it is very important that what Noriko Aikawa says about this the relationship between the convention and the communities. So actually, the link between the convention and the community is very important, but is no direct link for now, but it is very important to safeguard the ICH. So, Noriko-san, can you say additional opinion or comment address, please?
Thank you. Thank you. Is the microphone open? Oh, okay. I just wanted to say that the marriage of two conventions is not yet should not be taken place now, not yet. It's too early in my opinion, it's too early because, you know, the ICH convention is addressing directly to the community. And people who are involved in the ICH in each state parties are the people who are concerned about the communities, while the Tangible Heritage, World Heritage conventions are addressing the more, you know, higher placed governmental people or public. So it's not addressing to the same public. And our preoccupation at this moment is for the ICH is to have a direct access to the community people. So I think its time is not ripe yet to have this marriage of two conventions. This is what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Gamini, do you want to say, reply something? It's a very difficult issue.
In one or two words, I think if you look at I think the most important part of the 2003 convention is the relationship between heritage and people, communities, as absolutely no question, which was missing in the 72 convention. But if you read the convention now, if you read the operational guidelines now, if you read the philosophy now, they are going more and more and more towards community. So it's the perhaps Intangible Heritage Convention, 2003 Convention, can teach them more or bring them more, because heritage, after all, is to do with communities and not the government, not the state, not others. It is to do with people. So that is why we even talk about people-centered approaches within that. So if you, I highlighted only a few things, how communities are being recognized in the 72 convention, but perhaps need more. Thank you. You can help.
Thank you very much. Maybe this issue is a very big, too big to handle it now. So, but I'm sorry that because of the time restraint. So now I have to conclude this general discussion. So thank you very much for your all the panelists and commentators, and also all the participants online.
Thank you, Mr. Ishimura, for moderating the wonderful discussion, and thank you all the presenters and the commentator for your great contribution. We also thank all the participants for staying with us up to the end of the session, and we apologize that we had no time for answering your question due to the time constraint. Well, this concludes the first session of the seminar. Again, thank you very much for your attendance and all the presenters for your contributions. Now you may all exit from the webinar. Have a nice day ahead.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you, IRCI. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, IRCI. Thank you, everyone. Nice meeting you all.
Likewise.
Mhm.